It was the morning of June 5th, 1967, a moment that should have been predictable, almost routine, at least on paper. The desert air carried that dry, tense silence that always comes just before history changes direction. And then, suddenly, hundreds of tanks began to move. But these weren't the sleek, modern machines you'd expect in a war that belonged to the Cold War era. No, these were relics. Steel ghosts from a war that had ended more than 2 decades earlier. These were Sherman tanks. As they rolled forward across 3 different fronts, their engines roaring against the desert wind, their crews understood something deeply unsettling. They were climbing into machines that, by every logical measure, should not even exist on a battlefield anymore. These tanks were 23 years old. Some had once crossed the Rhine River alongside Patton's Third Army. Others had fought through the mountains of Italy or the dense jungles of the Pacific. Their original purpose had already been fulfilled long ago, and yet here they were again. But these were not the same Shermans that had fought in World War II. Not anymore. Over the years, they had been torn apart, rebuilt, modified, and reimagined in ways their original designers could never have imagined. Their hulls had been forged in American factories in places like Detroit and Philadelphia. But their guns? Those came from France, designed for tanks that didn't even exist when these Shermans first saw combat. Their engines had been replaced, their suspensions upgraded, their turrets reshaped and modified until they barely resembled the original design. Some of these tanks had been purchased from European scrapyards for almost nothing. Rusting hulls, broken machines sold off as useless metal. They were shipped secretly, sometimes disguised as agricultural equipment, smuggled through ports, and then brought back to life in small workshops scattered across Israel. Mechanics worked with whatever they had. No official blueprints, no factory support, just determination and raw mechanical skill. And somehow they worked. But on that morning, as these rebuilt machines rolled toward battle, they weren't facing outdated enemies. Their opponents were equipped with some of the most modern tanks of the time, Soviet-built T-54s and T-55s, machines with sloped armor that could deflect incoming rounds, powerful 100mm guns capable of destroying targets at long range, infrared night vision systems, stabilized weapons that could fire accurately even while moving. On paper, this wasn't supposed to be a battle. It was supposed to be a massacre. The Sherman was designed from another era, a war that had ended before many of the opposing tank crews were even born. The T-55, on the other hand, represented the future of armored warfare. It was the backbone of Soviet military doctrine, exported across continents, operated by trained crews who had spent months preparing for exactly this kind of conflict. They had the numbers. They had the technology. They had the advantage. And yet, what happened over the next 6 days would completely destroy the idea that wars are decided by specifications alone. Because the Sherman tank was never supposed to survive past 1945 in the first place. When American engineers designed it during World War II, they weren't trying to create the most powerful tank in the world. They had a completely different goal. They wanted something simple, something reliable, something that could be built in massive numbers without slowing down production lines. Factories across the United States, many of them originally designed for automobiles, were converted into tank production plants. 11 different factories produced Shermans. The Detroit tank arsenal alone, managed by Chrysler, built nearly 18,000 units. By the end of the war, over 49,000 Shermans had been produced. It wasn't about perfection. It was about quantity. It was about winning through production. And yes, the Sherman had flaws. Serious ones. Its armor was thin compared to German heavy tanks like the Tiger and Panther. At best, its frontal armor reached around 76mm, not nearly enough to reliably stop enemy fire. Its original 75mm guns struggled against heavily armored targets. Crews often had to get dangerously close or rely on flanking shots just to have a chance at penetrating enemy armor. And then there was the fire problem. Early models had a tendency to ignite when hit. Ammunition storage wasn't well protected, and once a shell penetrated the hull, it often triggered catastrophic fires. Crews barely had time to escape. American tankers even gave the Sherman a nickname, Ronson, after the lighter that supposedly lit every time. British crews had their own term, brewing up, and German soldiers, they called them Tommy cookers. Not exactly a reputation you want on the battlefield. But despite all of that, the Sherman had something far more valuable than raw power. It worked. It was reliable in ways that many advanced tanks simply weren't. German tanks, for example, were incredibly powerful but also incredibly fragile. Their complex designs meant frequent breakdowns. Transmissions failed. Engines overheated. Repairs required specialized tools and trained mechanics. The Sherman was different. A trained crew could replace its engine in the field within hours. Parts were standardized across all units. A component from one Sherman could fit another, regardless of where it had been built. This meant repairs were faster, logistics were simpler, and tanks spent more time fighting, instead of sitting broken in depots. It could cross bridges that heavier tanks couldn't. It could be transported easily by rail. It could be shipped across oceans without special modifications. These weren't glamorous advantages, but they mattered, because in war, the tank that actually reaches a battlefield is always more important than the one that looks better on paper. When World War II ended in 1945, thousands of Shermans were left behind. The United States no longer needed them. Newer tanks were already being developed. More powerful, more advanced, better suited for future conflicts. The Sherman was officially obsolete, and so it was discarded. Some were sent to allied nations. Others were placed in storage. Many were simply sold off as scrap, left to rust in yards across Europe and beyond. It seemed inevitable that the Sherman would fade into history, just another weapon that had served its time and been replaced. But something unexpected happened. The Sherman refused to die. Instead of disappearing, it spread across the world. Different countries picked it up, modified it, adapted it, and gave it new life. And the first real test of this unexpected second life came just a few years later, in a place far from the battlefields of Europe, Korea. June 25, 1950. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel with hundreds of Soviet-built T-34 tanks, machines that had already proven themselves against Nazi Germany. They were fast, powerful, and well-handled by trained crews. American forces stationed in Japan weren't ready. They had almost no tanks capable of stopping this advance. Infantry units tried to fight back using bazookas, but the rockets simply bounced off the T-34's armor. Requests for tank support were met with a simple, terrifying answer. There were no tanks available. So commanders began searching, desperately looking across bases in Japan for anything that could still move, still fire, still fight. And what they found were Shermans. Old, scattered, partially forgotten machines, sitting in various states of disrepair. But they were all they had. And so they were brought back into service. Crews hastily assembled, machines quickly repaired, and within weeks, these aging tanks were being shipped into a war they were never meant to fight. A war that would prove, once again, that being outdated doesn't mean being useless. Within weeks, those hastily gathered Shermans were rolling toward the front lines in Korea. These weren't brand-new machines fresh from factories. These were survivors, late-war variants known as the M4 A3E8, often called the Easy 8. They had improved suspension systems, better guns, and just enough upgrades to give them a fighting chance. But even then, no one was truly confident. American crews were about to face Soviet-designed T-34 tanks, machines that already crushed German forces on the Eastern Front. During World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies, so their tanks had never fought each other. Now, for the first time, they would, and nobody knew what would happen. The first encounters were tense, uncertain, and brutally real. Early engagements showed just how dangerous the situation was. Lighter American tanks, like the M24 Chaffee, were completely outmatched. Their guns struggled to penetrate T-34 armor, while incoming fire from Soviet tanks tore through them with ease. But when the Shermans arrived, something changed. These older tanks, designed years earlier, began holding their ground. The 76mm gun mounted on the Easy 8 proved capable of penetrating the T-34's armor at standard combat ranges. And more importantly, American crews had access to better ammunition, high-velocity armor-piercing rounds that significantly increased their effectiveness. But the real advantage wasn't just the gun. It was everything else. Sherman crews had superior optics. Their sights allowed them to acquire targets faster, aim more accurately, and fire with greater confidence. In tank warfare, this matters more than people think. The first accurate shot often decides the outcome. The crew that sees the enemy first usually survives. And then there was crew coordination. The Sherman had a 5-man crew: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and bow gunner. Each had a dedicated role. Each focused on a single task. This level of specialization created efficiency under pressure. The T-34, on the other hand, operated with only 4 crew members. The commander had to double as a loader, dividing attention between observing the battlefield and handling ammunition. In the chaos of combat, even a second of distraction can be fatal. Between July and November 1950, Shermans began proving themselves again. Reports showed that they had destroyed dozens of enemy tanks while supporting infantry across the Pusan perimeter, one of the most desperate defensive stands of the war. The tank that was supposed to be obsolete was winning. One of the first confirmed tank versus tank battles took place near Chonan on July 10th. American forces initially suffered losses when lighter tanks were engaged. But once Shermans entered the fight, the balance shifted. They could take hits that destroyed lighter vehicles. They could return fire that actually penetrated enemy armor. And slowly, steadily, they pushed back. Throughout the summer, Sherman crews fought relentless engagements. At the Pusan perimeter, where United Nations forces were nearly pushed into the sea, these tanks became a lifeline. They supported infantry, broke enemy advances, and held defensive lines under constant pressure. By the end of 1950, hundreds of Shermans had been deployed to Korea. They fought alongside newer tanks like the M26 Pershing and M46 Patton, but they remained a crucial part of the battlefield, and they proved something important. Obsolete equipment in the hands of trained crews could still defeat modern enemies. It wasn't just about the tank. It was about the people inside it. This lesson would echo across decades, repeating itself in different wars, different countries, and different battlefields. But Korea was only the beginning. The true transformation of the Sherman, the moment it went from being an old tank to something entirely new, happened somewhere no American engineer had ever planned for: Israel. In the late 1940s, the newly formed state of Israel faced an immediate and overwhelming challenge. Surrounded by hostile neighbors, lacking resources, and cut off from major arms suppliers, the country had to build its military almost from nothing. And somehow, the Sherman became part of that story. The first Sherman that Israel acquired wasn't purchased through official channels. It wasn't delivered as part of a military agreement. It wasn't even fully functional. It was improvised. In May 1948, as British forces withdrew from the region, one Sherman tank ended up in the hands of Jewish fighters. It arrived without its main gun, a tank without a weapon, almost useless. But almost wasn't good enough. Israeli mechanics got to work. They found a 75mm gun from another source and mounted it onto the tank. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't standard. But it worked. They named the tank Meir, and it went into battle. That single machine fought alongside other improvised vehicles, trucks, armored cars, anything that could carry a weapon. Workshops built weapons using whatever they could find: old field guns, spare parts, even equipment purchased secretly from Europe. There was no official system, only necessity. And over time, that necessity turned into innovation. Israeli agents began searching across Europe for more Shermans. They found them in scrapyards, abandoned, damaged, stripped of parts, left behind after World War II. These tanks were considered worthless, their engines destroyed, their guns removed, their hulls rusting. Perfect, because to Israeli engineers, these weren't useless machines. They were raw material. They bought them for almost nothing and shipped them back. Mechanics stripped them down to bare metal. Engines were rebuilt or replaced. Guns were installed using whatever was available. Some tanks even received howitzers meant for infantry support. Every single vehicle was different. Every single one was a solution to a problem. By the early 1950s, Israel had built an entire armored force based on these rebuilt Shermans. Hundreds of tanks, all slightly different, all functioning, all ready to fight. But there was one problem they couldn't ignore: firepower. The original Sherman guns, whether 75 millimeters or 76 millimeters, were no longer enough. Arab nations surrounding Israel were receiving modern Soviet tanks, T-34S, and eventually even more advanced designs like the T-54. These weren't the same enemies as before, and Israeli commanders knew it. If war came again, their tanks wouldn't be able to compete. So they faced a choice: replace their entire fleet, which they couldn't afford, or transform what they already had. And that's when a bold, almost unbelievable idea emerged. In 1953, Israeli officers visited France to study a new tank, the AMX-13. It was small, light, and fast. But what caught their attention wasn't the tank itself. It was the gun, a high-velocity 75 millimeters weapon capable of penetrating modern armor. Powerful, accurate, effective. And suddenly a question appeared. What if they took that gun and put it on a Sherman? At first, it sounded ridiculous. The Sherman was never designed to carry such a weapon. The turret wasn't built for it. The recoil would be too strong. The balance would be off. The entire structure would need to be modified. But Israeli engineers didn't see problems. They saw possibilities. And with help from French engineers, they began working on something that should not have been possible. They started redesigning the turret, adjusting internal space, reinforcing structures, modifying storage, adapting everything piece by piece until a new gun could actually function inside an old American tank. It wasn't easy. Nothing about it was easy. But slowly it started to work. And by March 1956, the first of these modified tanks rolled out of Israeli workshops. They called it the M50, a Sherman reborn, a tank that had once been considered scrap, now carrying a weapon capable of fighting modern enemies. And as these new machines prepared for their first real test in combat, no one yet realized that this was only the beginning of an even more extreme transformation that would push the limits of engineering itself. No one yet realized that this was only the beginning of an even more extreme transformation that would push the limits of engineering itself. The M50 was just a first step. When these upgraded Shermans entered combat during the Suez Crisis in October 1956, they proved something important. The concept worked. Israeli crews now had a tank that could actually engage enemy armor at effective ranges. The French 75 millimeters gun gave them a fighting chance against Egyptian forces, even those equipped with upgraded vehicles. But a fighting chance was enough, because the battlefield was evolving faster than anyone expected. While Israel was improving its Shermans, Soviet technology was advancing even further. Egypt and Syria were now receiving T-54 and T-55 tanks, machines that represented a completely new level of armored warfare. Their sloped armor made them harder to penetrate. Their 100 millimeters guns could destroy targets from distances where older tanks struggled to respond. Against these machines, even the M50 was starting to fall behind. Israeli commanders understood the reality clearly. If another war came, they would be outgunned again. And this time, the gap would be even more dangerous. So instead of stopping, they pushed further, much further. In 1961, Israel began working on a new upgrade that sounded almost impossible. If mounting a high-velocity 75 millimeters gun had been difficult, this next step was something else entirely. They wanted to install a 105 millimeters gun. Not just any gun, a weapon designed for modern main battle tanks like the French AMX-30, a cannon far more powerful than anything the Sherman had ever carried. A gun capable of destroying the latest Soviet tanks. But there was one problem. Actually, there were many problems. The Sherman's turret had never been designed to handle that kind of firepower. The recoil alone could tear the structure apart. The size of the gun created balance issues. Ammunition storage became a serious challenge inside the already cramped interior. On paper, it shouldn't work. But once again, Israeli engineers didn't care about should. They focused on how. They shortened the barrel slightly to make it fit within the turret's physical limits. They added a massive muzzle brake to absorb and redirect recoil forces. They redesigned the ammunition to use smaller cartridges, reducing pressure while still maintaining enough power to remain effective. And most importantly, they switched to heat rounds, high explosive anti-tank ammunition. This changed everything. Unlike traditional armor-piercing shells that relied on speed and impact force, heat rounds used shaped charges to penetrate armor. This meant that even with reduced velocity, the shell could still destroy heavily armored targets. In simple terms, they need more speed. They needed smarter firepower. And that's exactly what they created. By 1962, the first of these upgraded tanks entered service. They called it the M51. At this point, the transformation was complete. This was no longer just a modified Sherman. This was something entirely new, a World War II tank, carrying modern anti-tank firepower, capable of facing the most advanced Soviet designs of its time. Visually, it looked strange. The long gun with its massive muzzle brake dominated the tank's silhouette. The turret sat higher than before due to internal modifications. External storage racks, extra armor plates, and field modifications gave each tank a slightly different appearance. No two were exactly alike. They looked improvised, but they worked. And more importantly, the crews trusted them. These weren't factory-built machines assembled in perfect conditions. These were tanks rebuilt in workshops, modified by mechanics who had learned through experience, trial, and sometimes failure. Every adjustment had been tested in real conditions. Every improvement came from necessity. This created something unique, a tank that wasn't just built, but understood. By the time 1967 arrived, Israel had hundreds of these upgraded Shermans, M50s and M51s, ready for combat. They formed a significant portion of the country's armored forces, alongside more modern tanks like Centurions and AMX-13s. And then war came again. June 5, 1967, the Six-Day War. Israel faced a massive threat. Around 2,500 Arab tanks across multiple fronts, many of the modern Soviet designs. In comparison, Israel had roughly 800 tanks in total, outnumbered, outgunned, and yet ready. One of the most critical battles took place at Abu Ajila in the Sinai Desert. This wasn't just a fight. It was a test of everything Israel had built, learned, and prepared for. Egyptian forces had created a heavily fortified defensive network, minefields, anti-tank ditches, entrenched infantry, and tanks positioned in hull-down defensive positions. Everything was designed to stop an advancing force, and it should have worked. Israeli General Ariel Sharon was given the task of breaking through this defensive line. His plan wasn't simple. It wasn't direct. It was coordinated, complex, and risky. Artillery would bombard Egyptian positions. Paratroopers would land behind enemy lines to neutralize key threats. Infantry would advance through unexpected routes. And armored units, including the modified Shermans, would strike from multiple directions. When the battle began, chaos unfolded across the battlefield. Israeli M50 and M51 Shermans advanced into combat, their guns ready. Egyptian tanks opened fire. Anti-tank defenses activated. Explosions lit up the desert as both sides clashed in intense fighting. And then something remarkable happened. The Shermans held their ground. Their guns, especially the 105 millimeters on the M51, proved capable of penetrating enemy armor. Crews who had trained extensively with their modified machines knew exactly how to use them. They understood their strengths. They knew their limits, and they fought accordingly. Within just a few hours, Egyptian defensive positions began to collapse. After 3 hours of intense fighting on June 6th, Israeli forces had destroyed key Egyptian tank units and anti-tank defenses. The road into central Sinai was open. It was a breakthrough that shouldn't have been possible, but it happened, and it wasn't just Abu Ajila. Across all fronts, Sinai, West Bank, and Golan Heights, modified Shermans were fighting, advancing, and winning. They engaged T-34s, T-54s, and other modern tanks in battles where, on paper, they should have been outmatched. But war isn't fought on paper. In one-night engagement near Jenin, Israeli Shermans faced Jordanian M47 Patton tanks, far more modern vehicles with powerful 90mm guns. Under normal circumstances, The Patton should have had a clear advantage, but the fight didn't happen under normal circumstances. It happened in darkness. Israeli crews used turret-mounted spotlights, a field modification, to illuminate enemy positions. The sudden light disoriented Jordanian crews. Israeli gunners reacted faster, fired first, and used their training to dominate the engagement. Several Jordanian tanks were destroyed. This time, the Sherman was about to face a battlefield it could no longer dominate. October 6, 1973. The attack came without warning. Egyptian forces surged across the Suez Canal, executing one of the most carefully planned operations of the modern era. Using high-pressure water cannons, they blasted through the massive sand barriers of the Bar-Lev line, defenses that Israeli planners once believed were nearly impossible to breach. At the same time, Syrian armored divisions poured into the Golan Heights. This wasn't just another war. This was something different, because the enemy had changed. They weren't relying only on tanks anymore. They brought new weapons, new tactics, and a level of coordination that Israeli forces had never faced before. Soviet-built T-62 tanks entered the battlefield, equipped with 115mm smoothbore guns capable of firing high-velocity rounds that could penetrate Israeli armor at ranges previously considered safe. But even more dangerous than the tanks were the missiles. For the first time on a large scale, anti-tank guided missiles like the Sagger were used effectively against armored forces. And they changed everything. These missiles allowed infantry soldiers to destroy tanks from long distances where tank crews couldn't even see their attackers clearly, let alone respond. Suddenly, armor was no longer invincible. It was vulnerable, very vulnerable. Israeli forces scrambled to respond. Reserve units were called in. Tanks were rushed to the front lines as quickly as possible. Among them, the modified Shermans, M50s and M51s, machines that had proven themselves in 1967, once again entered battle. But this time, the conditions were completely different. On the Golan Heights, Israeli tank crews faced overwhelming numbers. Syrian forces advanced in waves, supported by artillery, infantry, and missile teams. The battlefield was chaotic, intense, and unforgiving. Sherman crews fought with everything they had. Their 105mm guns could still, in theory, penetrate the armor of modern tanks using heat rounds. On paper, they still had a chance. But reality was harsher. Enemy crews were better trained. Tactics were more advanced. Weapons were deadlier. Missiles struck from hidden positions. Tanks were destroyed before they could even identify where the attack came from. The Sherman's thin armor, a weakness since World War II, now became a fatal flaw. Hits that might have been survivable before were now catastrophic. Losses mounted quickly. Crews who had survived the Six-Day War now faced a different kind of battlefield, one where experience alone couldn't compensate for technological gaps. Still, they fought. Israeli tankers, whether in Sherman, Centurions, or Pattons, held defensive positions against overwhelming odds. In some areas, small groups of tanks delayed entire enemy advances, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. It wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. It wasn't guaranteed. But it worked just enough. Israel managed to stabilize the front lines through rapid mobilization, emergency resupply from allies, and sheer determination. Counterattacks began. Momentum slowly shifted, but the cost was clear. The Sherman had reached its limit. For decades, it had adapted. It had been modified, upgraded, rebuilt, and pushed far beyond its original design. It had fought in deserts, mountains, jungles, and cities. It had faced enemies it was never meant to fight, and it had survived. But now, it had finally met a battlefield where adaptation alone was no longer enough. After the war, the decision became inevitable. The Sherman would be retired from frontline service in the Israeli Defense Forces. By the late 1970s, remaining M50s and M51s were gradually phased out. Some were placed into reserve. Others were repurposed. Many were sold or transferred to Allied forces. It was the end of an era, but not the end of the story. Because even after leaving Israel's front lines, the Sherman refused to disappear. Instead, it moved again into new conflicts, new countries, new roles that its original designers could never have imagined. During the Lebanese Civil War, which began in 1975, modified Shermans found themselves fighting in a completely different kind of battlefield, urban warfare. Israel supplied around 75 M50 Shermans to Allied Christian militias. These tanks operated in the narrow streets of Beirut, far removed from the open desert battles they were designed for. Buildings replaced dunes. Ambushes replaced open engagements. Close-range fighting replaced long-distance duels. And still, the Sherman adapted. Even more surprising, some of these tanks eventually ended up in the hands of opposing forces. The Palestine Liberation Organization captured at least 2 Shermans and used them during the defense of West Beirut in 1982. Think about that for a moment. A tank designed to fight Nazi Germany, now fighting in the streets of Lebanon, decades later, on both sides of the conflict. It sounds unreal, but it happened, and it showed something remarkable. The Sherman wasn't just a tank anymore. It was a platform, a machine that could be reused, repurposed, and reimagined depending on who controlled it and what they needed. While conflict continued in the Middle East, the Sherman quietly found new life on another continent, South America. By the late 1970s, tensions between Chile and Argentina were rising rapidly over disputed territory in the Beagle Channel. Both nations began preparing for a possible war. Troops mobilized, equipment was deployed, and once again the Sherman appeared. Chile had acquired modified Shermans from Israel, M50s and M51s, equipped with powerful guns capable of threatening even modern tanks. Argentina, on the other hand, took a different approach. They operated Sherman Fireflies, a British variant from World War II equipped with a famous 17-pounder gun. But even that wasn't enough anymore, so they upgraded them. They replaced the old guns with French 105mm cannons. They installed diesel engines for better performance and reliability. They improved suspension systems and adapted the tanks for local terrain. Different country, same solution. Take an old Sherman and make it new again. It was almost surreal. 2 nations, both preparing for war, both using tanks designed in the 1940s, both upgraded in different ways, ready to face each other in a conflict that belonged to the late 20th century. But the war never came. A storm delayed Argentine operations. Diplomatic intervention followed. Pope John Paul II stepped in to mediate. And just like that, the conflict paused. The tanks never fired at each other, but they remained ready. Chile continued using Shermans into the early 2000s, eventually replacing them with modern Leopard tanks. Argentina kept its upgraded versions in service into the 1990s. And even then, the story didn't end, because some Shermans lasted even longer, much longer. In Paraguay, a small number of upgraded Shermans remained in service until 2018. Let that sink in. A tank designed in 1941, built for a war that ended in 1945, still operational more than 70 years later. They served in ceremonial roles, training exercises and national events, not as frontline combat vehicles, but still active, still running, still part of a military force. It was something no one could have predicted, a lifespan that defied logic, a machine that refused to become history. And as these final Shermans slowly approached retirement, they left behind a legacy that had very little to do with armor thickness, gun size, or battlefield statistics, and everything to do with something far more important. They left behind a legacy that had very little to do with armor thickness, gun size, or battlefield statistics, and everything to do with something far more important. Because when you step back and look at the Sherman story, you realize something surprising. It was never the best tank. Not in World War II. Not in Korea. Not in the Middle East. In almost every conflict it fought in, there was always something better. German Tigers and Panthers had thicker armor and more powerful guns. Soviet T-34s and later T-54s brought better balance and evolution. Cold War tanks completely outclassed the Sherman in technology, firepower, and protection. On paper, the Sherman should have disappeared early. But it didn't, and that's the part that matters. Because the Sherman wasn't built to be perfect. It was built to work. That difference changed everything. From the very beginning, American engineers made a decision that seemed almost boring compared to other nations. They didn't chase the most powerful gun or the thickest armor. Instead, They focused on something far more practical: reliability, standardization, simplicity. Every Sherman, no matter where it was built, shared the same basic components: track links, wheels, engines, transmissions, all designed to be interchangeable. A mechanic didn't need specialized knowledge for each individual tank. If you could fix one Sherman, you could fix any Sherman. And that mattered more than anything else, because in war, machines break. And when they break, the ones that can be repaired quickly are the ones that return to the fight. German tanks were powerful, yes, but they were also complex. When a Tiger broke down, it often required specialized tools, trained crews, and parts that weren't always available. Many of them never made it back to the battlefield. The Sherman was different. If it broke, you fixed it. If it couldn't be fixed, you used its parts to repair another one. It was simple, practical, effective, and after the war, those same qualities gave it a second life. Countries that couldn't afford modern tanks didn't need expensive factories or advanced supply chains. They just needed basic tools, mechanical understanding, and determination. That's exactly what happened in places like Israel. Mechanics there didn't have support from American companies. No official manuals. No direct engineering assistance. Just old, damaged tanks and the need to make them work. So they improvised. They took French guns and mounted them on American turrets. They replaced engines with whatever they could find. They modified suspension systems using parts from completely different designs. They didn't ask if it was possible. They made it possible. And that's what turned the Sherman into something more than just a tank. It became a platform, a foundation that could evolve depending on who used it. This is why the Sherman kept appearing again and again in conflicts across the world. In Korea, it proved that training and coordination could overcome newer designs. In Israel, it showed how innovation could transform outdated machines into modern weapons. In South America, it demonstrated how necessity drives adaptation. In Lebanon, it even survived urban warfare far beyond its original purpose. Each time it adapted, each time it survived, and sometimes it even won. But maybe the most important lesson came from battles like Assault Uttar during the Indo-Pakistani War in 1965. There, Indian forces used terrain, tactics, and preparation to defeat a much stronger armored force equipped with modern patent tanks. The Shermans involved weren't superior machines, not even close, but they were used correctly. Defensive positions, flooded terrain, close-range engagements. All of it turned a technological disadvantage into a tactical victory. And that's the truth most people don't realize. Wars are not won by machines alone. They are won by people, by crews who understand their equipment, by commanders who use terrain and timing wisely, by mechanics who keep machines running when they should have failed. The Sherman survived because it allowed all of that. It didn't demand perfection. It worked with what was available. And because of that, it lasted longer than anyone expected. Much longer. Think about it. A tank designed in 1941, produced until 1945, still in service in 2018, 73 years of operational life, across continents, across generations, across completely different types of warfare. Very few military machines in history can claim something like that. And even in its final years, the Sherman wasn't just sitting in a museum. It was still active, still maintained, still respected, because by then it wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of adaptability, a symbol of practicality, a symbol of human ingenuity. The mechanics who rebuilt those tanks in small workshops, the crews who fought them against overwhelming odds, they are the real story, not the steel, not the specifications, but the people behind them. Because when everything else fails, when resources are limited, when the situation looks impossible, those are the people who find a way. And that's exactly what the Sherman represents. Not the most powerful machine, but the one that refused to stop, even when it should have, even when it was outdated, even when it was written off as scrap. It kept going. And in doing so, it proved something that goes far beyond tanks, beyond war, beyond history itself. That sometimes being good enough and refusing to quit is more powerful than being the best. Agar tum yes story powerful lagi, Jahanak Obsolete, tank any decades tactanaya could different battlefields par apni jogbane rocky. To ek like zero or caro. Subscribe caro agar tum ac high reel. Hidden History Stories Deknachat, Hoja Machines Esi Zayada, Unlagan ki kahani hodi hai jo anichale hain. Or comment main zero or batana. Tum kahan esi dekrai ho. Kyanki ye kahani surf ek tank ki nai. Ye unlagan ki kahani hai johar mushkil main solution dun lead hain.